I think it's better if Ashley handles the holidays from now on, my son said. And just like that, I understood I had been replaced. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. Daniel stood in the doorway of my own kitchen, hands in the pockets of the wool coat I bought him last Christmas, and spoke as if he were suggesting we switch brands of coffee. Ashley was behind him, quiet, composed, her hand resting lightly on his arm as though she were steadying him, or guiding him. I dried my hands on a dish towel and nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him that for 42 years, Thanksgiving had happened at my table, that every Christmas morning began with my cinnamon rolls rising before dawn, that the 4th of July barbecue in this very backyard was something neighbors marked on their calendars. I simply said, if that's what you both prefer. The kitchen felt different after that. The same oak cabinets. The same porcelain sink Harold installed himself the summer before he passed. But something had shifted, subtle and cold, like a draft you can't quite locate. Ashley stepped forward then, her smile polite, efficient. It's just easier this way, Margaret. We want to start our own traditions. Start our own traditions. As if the ones I built were clutter. As if I were part of the old furniture that needed to be moved into storage. I folded the towel carefully and placed it beside the stove. I noticed small things in that moment. The new framed photo on the refrigerator, Daniel, Ashley, and the kids at the apple orchard last weekend. I hadn't known they were going. The group text thread I was no longer included in. The way Ashley had rearranged the pantry shelves, moving my labeled glass jars to the top, where I'd need a step stool to reach them. No one had asked. No one had mentioned it. Replacement doesn't happen all at once. It happens in inches. In calendar invites you never receive. In recipes rewritten without your name attached. In grandchildren who start saying, Mom does it this way now. I walked to the dining room and ran my fingers along the back of my chair. The one at the head of the table where I'd always sat, not out of authority, but because Harold liked to see me there. Last Sunday, Ashley had taken that seat while discussing plans for Christmas. I had chosen a chair at the side without comment. Daniel cleared his throat. We just think it's time, he added, softer now, as if gentleness would cushion the meaning. Time for what? Time for me to fade into the background. Time for my name to be mentioned only in past tense while I was still standing in the room. I met his eyes, the same hazel eyes that once searched for me in crowded school auditoriums. Of course, I said. And I meant it. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. The kind of hurt that settles behind your ribs and stays quiet. But resistance would have required me to prove I still belonged. And I have never begged for a place in my own home. Ashley began outlining her plans. Matching pajamas for Christmas Eve, catered sides for Thanksgiving, a professional photographer for the annual family portrait. Efficient, modern, streamlined. I listened as though she were presenting a business proposal. In many ways, she was. She was consolidating control. I felt something unexpected then. Not rage. Not even jealousy. Clarity. I had been the center of this family for decades, not because I demanded it, but because I carried it. The schedules. The birthdays. The quiet loans no one talked about. The down payment that helped Daniel and Ashley buy this house 5 miles from mine. The college fund I started for each grandchild before they could spell my name. They weren't pushing me out in anger. They were pushing me out in comfort, certain I would step aside gracefully. And I did. I smiled at Ashley. I kissed Daniel's cheek. I told them I was proud of them for building something of their own. When they left that afternoon, I stood alone in the doorway and watched their SUV disappear down Maple Drive. The winter air was sharp, just below 40 degrees, crisp enough to sting. I closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment. When they replaced me, I didn't resist. I simply began to observe. The house felt quieter the following week, not because anyone had taken anything away, but because I had stopped filling the silence. For years I had been the one who called on Sunday evenings to confirm dinner, who reminded Daniel about his annual physical, who mailed birthday cards 3 days early to make sure they arrived on time. That week, I did none of it. I woke up at 6 as I always did, brewed my coffee, and sat at the small round table by the kitchen window. The maple tree in the front yard had lost most of its leaves, thin branches scratching lightly against the pale November sky. I wrapped both hands around my mug and listened to the refrigerator hum. It occurred to me that no one had asked what I would be doing for Thanksgiving now that Ashley had taken over. No one had said, Margaret, will you join us? Or Margaret, what would you like to bring? The assumption was that I would simply arrive when told. I opened my planner, the leather one Harold gave me years ago, and noticed something else. The calendar squares that used to be crowded with notes in blue ink were almost empty. No reminders from Daniel. No penciled-in babysitting days. Even the weekly dinners had been replaced with a vague message from Ashley that read, "We will let you know what works for us." What works for us? I traced the indentation of those words in my memory and felt that same quiet clarity settle in again. Replacement had not been dramatic. It had been administrative. Later that afternoon, I drove to the grocery store, 5 miles down Route 17, and walked the aisles slowly. I picked up a small turkey breast out of habit, then set it back. There was no need to cook for 6 anymore. I bought fresh green beans, a loaf of sourdough bread, and a single slice of pumpkin pie from the bakery case. The young cashier smiled and asked if I was preparing for the holiday. I said, "Just keeping it simple this year." She nodded as if that were normal. Perhaps it was. That evening my phone lit up with photos in the family group thread. Ashley had created a shared album titled New Traditions. There were pictures of the children trying on matching flannel pajamas, of Daniel stringing white lights along their porch, of a test run for a new stuffing recipe. I studied each image carefully. No one had meant to exclude me, not overtly. But I was no longer the source. I was an optional guest. I set my phone down on the coffee table and walked through my house, room by room. The dining room where I had hosted every milestone. The living room where Harold used to fall asleep in his armchair with the evening news still playing. The hallway lined with framed photographs, many of them taken by me, rarely of me. I paused at one from 10 years ago. Daniel stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, smiling wide on the day he signed the papers for his first home. I remembered the cashier's check I had quietly handed him in the parking lot, so he would not have to drain his savings. He had hugged me then, and said he could not have done it without me. I wondered if he remembered that moment with the same clarity. I did not feel anger. I felt distance. A gentle but undeniable shift in gravity. I realized something else that night as I folded a blanket at the end of my bed. If I had truly been replaced, then the role I once carried had value. And value can be withdrawn. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness. Not heavy or bitter, just still. They were building something new. I was deciding what I would no longer build for them. I began to notice the details that most people would dismiss as small. The following Sunday arrived without the usual message from Daniel asking what time dinner would be ready. At 3 in the afternoon, I was still sitting in my living room with a book open on my lap, the pages unread. At 4:15, my phone vibrated. It was not a call. It was a photograph. The children were seated at a long farmhouse table I did not recognize, sunlight pouring in through large windows. Ashley had captioned it, "First official Sunday dinner at our place." I studied the image closely. The roast sat in the center. The green beans were arranged in a white ceramic dish identical to mine. Even the folded linen napkins looked familiar. For a moment, I wondered if she had purchased the same patterns intentionally, or if she had slowly absorbed my choices over the years without either of us realizing it. Daniel stood at the head of the table. My seat. His posture was straight, confident, almost formal. I enlarged the picture and counted the chairs. There were 6. There was no empty place setting. I set the phone down carefully, as though it might crack under sudden movement. The quiet in my house felt different that evening. Not lonely. Defined. I walked into my dining room and turned on the overhead light. The polished surface of my table reflected the chandelier above it, flawless and unused. I ran my hand across the wood grain and remembered the countless times I had ironed tablecloths here, the way Harold used to tease me for caring so much about presentation. Presentation matters, I would tell him. It makes people feel valued. I wondered if Ashley believed that too, or if presentation to her meant something else entirely. On Tuesday afternoon, I stopped by Daniel's house unannounced for the first time in years. I had baked banana bread that morning, more out of routine than intention. The drive took 8 minutes. The porch lights were already strung along the railing, though Thanksgiving was still days away. When Ashley opened the door, she looked surprised but composed. "Oh, Margaret, you should have texted," she said lightly. "We are trying to keep the afternoons structured for the kids." Structured. I handed her the wrapped loaf and smiled. I will remember that next time. The children hugged me quickly before running back to the living room where a large wall calendar had been mounted above the fireplace. I glanced at it without appearing to stare. Every square was filled in with neat handwriting. School events. Playdates. Date nights. Holiday prep. My name appeared once, in the bottom corner of December, penciled lightly beside the words cookie exchange. I realized then that I had been reduced to an entry, not a foundation, not a constant, an appointment. Daniel came in from the garage, wiping his hands on a shop towel, and kissed my cheek. "We are figuring things out, Mom," he said, as if anticipating a complaint I had not voiced. I nodded. "Of course you are. That is what adults do. We figure things out." I did not stay long. On the drive home, traffic was light, the sky already fading into a cold gray. I thought about how easily roles can be reassigned when people assume you will never revoke your access. They believed I would continue to show up, continue to give, continue to support without question. They believed my presence was guaranteed. That evening I opened the file cabinet in my study and pulled out a folder I had not reviewed in over a year. Inside were copies of property deeds, investment statements, and a neatly typed document bearing my full name. I sat down at my desk and read each page slowly, not with anger, but with precision. If I was now an appointment on their calendar, then I would decide how often I appeared, and under what terms. The next morning I scheduled an appointment with my attorney. I did not rush. I chose a time that fit neatly between my hair appointment and my usual walk around the neighborhood, as if I were adding just another ordinary task to my week. The law office sat 12 miles away in a quiet brick building near the courthouse, the same one Harold and I had visited when we first drafted our estate plan decades ago. The receptionist recognized my name and offered me coffee. I declined and folded my gloves carefully on my lap while I waited. When Mr. Halpern invited me into his office, he smiled in the polite way professionals do when they assume nothing has changed, and a clearer understanding of the levers available to me. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of November afternoon that carries the scent of snow even when the forecast promises none. On the drive home, I passed the elementary school where Daniel once waited for me after second grade, backpack sliding off his shoulder, scanning the parking lot until he spotted my car. I remembered how certain he had been that I would always arrive. I always did. Certainty is a powerful thing. It allows people to become comfortable enough to rearrange seats at a table without considering who built it. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner for myself. Grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, a glass of white wine poured precisely halfway. I set one place at the dining table instead of eating at the kitchen counter as I had the previous nights. I lit a single candle and watched the flame steady itself. There was something almost ceremonial about reclaiming my own space. After dinner, I opened my laptop and logged into my investment accounts. I reviewed balances, maturity dates, automatic transfers. For years, I had quietly contributed to a monthly fund for Daniel's household expenses, labeling it family support in my records. I hovered over the recurring transfer and selected pause. Not delete. Pause. I leaned back in my chair and felt an unfamiliar sense of calm settle over me. This was not revenge. Revenge is loud and impulsive. This was alignment. If my presence had become optional, then my provisions would follow the same rule. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Mom, we are finalizing the Thanksgiving guest list. Can you confirm by tomorrow?" I read it twice. Confirm. As if I were an acquaintance. I typed my response slowly. "I will let you know." Then I set the phone face down on the table and allowed the silence to return on my terms. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a sky the color of brushed steel and air cold enough to frost the edges of the windshield. I stood in my bedroom deciding what to wear, not because I was unsure of the weather, but because I understood presentation still mattered. I chose a charcoal wool dress, simple and structured, and the pearl earrings Harold gave me on our 30th anniversary. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. I did not look replaced. I looked composed. Daniel's house was already crowded when I arrived. Cars lined both sides of the street, unfamiliar license plates mixed with neighbors I barely recognized. Through the front windows I could see movement, silhouettes passing back and forth, the glow of warm light against the early afternoon gray. I rang the bell instead of using the spare key I once carried on my keychain. Ashley opened the door with a bright, efficient smile. "Margaret, you made it," she said, stepping aside. The scent of roasted turkey and sage drifted into the crisp air. Inside, the living room furniture had been rearranged to accommodate extra folding chairs. A long extension had been added to the dining table, dressed in a cream tablecloth I knew she purchased new for the occasion. The children ran past me, their flannel pajamas replaced with coordinated sweaters in shades of burgundy and cream. They hugged my waist quickly before being called back to help set out place cards. Place cards. I removed my coat and handed it to Daniel, who kissed my cheek in a distracted way, already scanning the room for the next task. "We are glad you could come, Mom," he said. Could come. As though attendance required approval. I walked into the dining room and found my name printed neatly on a small card near the far end of the table. Not at the head. Not beside Daniel. Near the corner, between a distant cousin of Ashley's and a neighbor I had met only once. I did not hesitate. I took my seat without comment. Conversation swirled around me, loud and animated. Ashley moved confidently between the kitchen and dining room, directing timing, adjusting dishes, refilling glasses. She thanked her parents for helping with the pies. She thanked Daniel for carving the turkey. When everyone was seated, Daniel stood and cleared his throat. I felt a flicker of memory, recalling how he once insisted I say grace. Now he lifted his glass and spoke about gratitude, about growth, about building something meaningful for their children. He thanked Ashley for bringing new energy into the family. He thanked their friends for supporting their traditions. My name was not mentioned. The omission was deliberate in its softness. Not hostile, not accidental, simply unnecessary. I folded my napkin in my lap and listened to the applause that followed his brief speech. The meal was well prepared. The turkey moist, the stuffing seasoned carefully, the cranberry sauce molded into a perfect ring. Ashley had done her research. She had observed me for years. I tasted each dish thoughtfully and complimented her effort. "You have organized this beautifully," I said, meeting her eyes steadily. She smiled, perhaps searching for a hint of resentment that did not appear. Halfway through dessert, I noticed Daniel checking his phone with a faint crease in his forehead. He leaned toward Ashley and whispered something. She frowned slightly before smoothing her expression. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone reviewing numbers. Someone calculating. The monthly transfer that had once arrived without fail had not appeared this week. They had not mentioned it directly, but I could feel the awareness settling in. After coffee was served, Ashley stood again and announced that from now on, Thanksgiving would officially be hosted here, a new chapter for the family. There was polite clapping. I joined in. Then I lifted my cup, porcelain warm against my fingers, and spoke softly enough that only those nearest could hear. "Traditions evolve," I said, "and so do responsibilities." Daniel glanced at me, uncertain. I held his gaze for a brief second, then looked away, serene. I finished my coffee, placed the cup gently on its saucer, and knew that something had shifted again, not at the head of the table, but beneath it. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Daniel called at 8:30 in the evening, a time he usually reserved for quick updates about the children or questions about a recipe. His voice carried a strain he attempted to disguise with casual tone. "Mom, did you change something with the bank transfer?" he asked, as if the matter were purely administrative. I sat in my reading chair with a wool blanket folded across my knees and allowed a small pause before answering. "I adjusted it," I said. "Adjusted how?" he pressed gently. I could hear the low murmur of the television in the background at his house and the faint clatter of dishes, likely Ashley finishing the kitchen. I decided it was important to remain calm. "I have been reviewing my financial plans, Daniel. It is a responsible thing to do at my age." Silence followed. Not dramatic, just unsettled. "We were counting on that contribution for a few expenses," he finally admitted. "The property taxes increased this year, and we committed to a holiday trip for the children." I pictured the wall calendar above his fireplace, every square filled with confident ink. Commitments had been made with the assumption of steady support. "I understand," I replied. "That is why I believe it is healthy for each household to manage its own commitments." He exhaled slowly. "It is not that we do not appreciate everything you have done, Mom. It is just that things are different now." I looked around my quiet living room, the lamps casting soft pools of light across the hardwood floor. "Yes," I said. "They are." He did not argue further. Instead, he shifted to polite conversation about the children's school projects and the upcoming winter concert. When we ended the call, I felt no triumph, only confirmation. The following week I received a message from Ashley asking if we could meet for coffee. She suggested a modern cafe downtown, the kind with exposed brick walls and handwritten chalkboard menus. I arrived precisely on time. She was already seated by the window, her laptop open, her posture upright and efficient. "Margaret," she began after exchanging brief pleasantries, "we have noticed some changes." I folded my gloves and placed them neatly beside my cup. "Change is part of growth," I said evenly. She smiled, but her eyes measured me carefully. "We just want to make sure everything is fair and transparent." Transparent. I appreciated the choice of word. Transparency requires clarity. "I have been very clear," I replied. "For many years I offered support without conditions. That arrangement is evolving." She leaned back slightly, perhaps recalibrating. "We never intended to exclude you from anything," she said. "The holidays were about creating our own identity." I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream blend into the dark surface. "Identity does not require dependency," I said softly. "Nor does independence require distance." The conversation remained polite, almost corporate in tone. She did not accuse. I did not defend. When we stood to leave, she touched my arm lightly and said, "We value you." I met her gaze steadily. Value is demonstrated through behavior, not statements. Outside, the air had turned sharply cold, dipping below freezing as December settled in. I walked to my car without hurry. The decorations on Main Street shimmered against the gray sky, bright and confident. I realized that the shift I had begun was not about punishing them. It was about restoring proportion. For years, my presence and my provisions had been intertwined. Now they would learn the difference. That evening, I opened my planner and scheduled a meeting with my financial advisor to discuss long-term restructuring. Not drastic, deliberate. If I was no longer the foundation of their household, then I would reinforce my own. And I would do it quietly. By mid-December, the temperature had dropped into the low 30s, and the first thin layer of ice clung to the edges of my front steps each morning. I had already met with my financial advisor twice, not to dismantle anything abruptly, but to realign long-term plans with quiet precision. The trust for the grandchildren remained intact, but I adjusted the timeline of access. Educational funds would be disbursed directly to institutions rather than through parental accounts. The lake cottage in Vermont would remain in my name, with future use structured through written agreements instead of assumed privilege. Each modification was legal, measured, and entirely within my rights. I signed the documents with a steady hand and left the office feeling neither victorious nor resentful, only organized. A few days later, Daniel stopped by unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. Snow flurries drifted lazily through the air, not yet heavy enough to stick. He stood on my porch longer than necessary before ringing the bell, as if rehearsing his words. When I opened the door, he smiled, but it did not quite reach his eyes. "Can we talk, Mom?" he asked. I stepped aside and led him into the living room, where a small fire flickered in the fireplace. I offered him coffee. He declined. He remained standing for a moment before finally sitting across from me, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. "Things feel tense lately," he began. "Ashley is worried that you are pulling away." I folded my hands in my lap and regarded him calmly. "Pulling away suggests distance without reason," I said. "I am adjusting." He sighed softly. "We never meant to make you feel sidelined. The holidays were about establishing our own rhythm." I nodded. "I understand that. And I support it." He looked at me carefully, perhaps searching for the edge of anger he expected to find. But I was not angry. I was deliberate. "The monthly support has helped us plan certain commitments," he admitted. "Without it, we need to reconsider some expenses." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Planning based on someone else's generosity can create imbalance, Daniel. Generosity should be appreciated, not relied upon." He was quiet after that. The fire crackled between us, steady and contained. I could see the calculation behind his expression, the recognition that something foundational had shifted. He asked about the children's college funds, about the cottage in Vermont, about whether those arrangements were still secure. I answered honestly. "They are secure," I said, "but structured. Structure protects everyone." He nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning beneath the words. Before leaving, he stood near the doorway and looked around the house he had grown up in. "You have always taken care of us," he said. I smiled gently. "I still am, just differently." After he left, I walked to my study and reviewed the updated documents once more, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to internalize the new architecture of my life. Outside, the snow had begun to settle in a thin white layer across the lawn, quiet and undisturbed. I realized that what unsettled them was not the financial adjustment itself. It was the realization that I no longer moved automatically in response to their expectations. For decades, I had been predictable in my support, unwavering in my presence. Predictability is comforting. Independence is not. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Ashley. "Thank you for meeting with Daniel today. We hope we can all move forward with clarity." I read the sentence carefully. Clarity. That word again. I typed a simple response. Clarity is exactly what I intend. Then I placed the phone down and watched the snow continue to fall, soft and certain, covering the ground without asking permission. The week before Christmas, I made a decision that had been forming quietly for months. I invited Daniel and Ashley to dinner at my house on the Sunday evening before the holiday, not as a plea for closeness, but as a formal gathering. I told them I had a few things I wanted to clarify for the coming year. Ashley responded within minutes, polite and agreeable. Daniel called to confirm the time, his voice careful, as though stepping across thin ice. I prepared the house the way I always had, though with less decoration than in years past. A simple evergreen wreath on the door, white candles along the mantel, no elaborate tablescape, no excessive effort. When they arrived, the children carried small wrapped gifts and ran inside with familiar excitement. I embraced them warmly, breathing in the scent of cold air clinging to their coats. Ashley handed me a bottle of wine and scanned the room, perhaps noticing the restraint in my arrangements. We sat down to dinner at 6 o'clock sharp. I had prepared a roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, nothing extravagant, just steady and warm. Conversation remained light through the meal. School stories, weather forecasts, plans for Christmas morning. I listened carefully, allowing them to fill the space. After dessert, I stood and walked to my study. I returned with a slim folder and placed it gently at the center of the table. Daniel's expression shifted immediately. Ashley straightened in her chair. "I wanted to review a few updates to my estate plans," I said calmly. "Nothing dramatic. Simply organized." I opened the folder and handed Daniel a copy of the revised summary. "The lake cottage in Vermont will remain solely in my name, with usage by invitation only. Educational funds for the children are now structured to be distributed directly to their universities. Monthly discretionary support has been permanently discontinued." Ashley's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, though her face remained composed. Daniel read each line slowly. "Mom, this feels sudden," he said. I shook my head gently. "It is not sudden. It is structured. I have realized that clarity prevents misunderstanding. I do not want generosity to be confused with obligation." Ashley spoke next, her tone measured. "We never intended to treat your help as an obligation." I met her gaze steadily. "Intentions are important. Outcomes are more important." The room grew still. Even the children seemed to sense a shift in atmosphere and lowered their voices in the living room. I continued in the same calm tone. "I support your independence. That is why I am reinforcing my own. There will be no confusion about roles going forward. You are building your household. I am maintaining mine." Daniel looked up from the papers, searching my face for anger or accusation. He found neither, only resolve. "So what does this mean for us?" he asked quietly. "It means that our relationship will no longer be defined by financial dependency. It will be defined by mutual respect." Ashley set her glass down carefully. "And if we disagree?" she asked. I folded my hands together on the table. "Then we disagree as adults, not as benefactor and beneficiary." Silence settled over the table, not hostile, but undeniable. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder. I did not demand signatures. I did not ask for approval. These decisions required neither. After a long pause, Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, though his voice carried the weight of recalculation. I rose and began clearing the plates, steady and unhurried. The foundation had been adjusted. Not loudly, not cruelly, simply reinforced in a way that could not be mistaken. Christmas morning arrived clear and bright. The snow from the previous week hardened into a thin white crust across the lawn. I woke before sunrise, not out of obligation, but habit. For decades I had been the first one up, preheating the oven, arranging gifts beneath the tree, ensuring that everything unfolded seamlessly for everyone else. This year, my house was quiet. No rushing footsteps. No whispered coordination in the hallway. I brewed my coffee and carried it to the front window, watching the pale gold light stretch slowly over the neighborhood. At 9 o'clock, my phone chimed with a message from Daniel. The children are opening gifts now. We will come by around noon if that still works. If that still works. I considered the phrasing with mild interest. It was no longer assumed that my schedule revolved around theirs. That change, subtle as it was, signaled understanding. Noon works, I replied simply. When they arrived, the children burst through the door with bright scarves trailing behind them, eager to show me their new bicycles and books and carefully chosen toys. I knelt to their height and listened to every excited explanation. Ashley stood near the entryway, composed but less guarded than before. Daniel carried a neatly wrapped box and placed it beneath my tree. We did not exchange long speeches. We moved through the morning calmly, exchanging gifts, sharing a light brunch I had prepared in advance. Nothing excessive. Fresh fruit, warm croissants, scrambled eggs, coffee poured evenly into each cup. The atmosphere felt different from previous holidays. Not tense, not overly warm, balanced. At one point, Daniel stepped aside with me near the kitchen doorway. I have been thinking about what you said, he began. About independence and respect. I met his eyes and waited. We relied on your support more than we realized, he admitted. Not just financially. Structurally. I nodded slowly. It is easy to confuse availability with obligation. He exhaled, a small release of something unspoken. We are adjusting our budget. Scaling back a few plans. It is uncomfortable, but it is ours. I appreciated the phrasing. Ours. Ashley approached then, holding her coffee with both hands. We want you involved, she said carefully, just not in a way that feels unbalanced. I studied her expression. For the first time, there was no attempt to control the narrative. Only acknowledgement. Involvement requires invitation, I said gently. And respect does not compete with leadership. She gave a small nod. The conversation did not extend into apology. It did not need to. The adjustment had already taken place. Later, as they prepared to leave, Daniel paused at the door. The cottage in Vermont, he said quietly. We understand it is yours. We would like to visit this summer, if you are open to that. The request was clear. Not assumed. I considered it briefly. Send me the dates you have in mind, I replied. We will discuss it. He smiled, not out of relief, but recognition. As their car disappeared down Maple Drive, I remained standing in the doorway for a moment, the cold air brushing against my face. I did not feel displaced. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. The foundation of my life no longer extended automatically into theirs. It stood firmly beneath me. They had reorganized their table. I had reinforced my own. And in doing so, I had not been diminished. I had been defined.